Okay. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Welcome to the session of capital allocation in macroeconomics. We're going to start with Andriy Parkovenko, who's going to talk us about the local causes and aggregate implications of land use regulation.
Hi, everybody. Thanks a lot for attending today, and thanks a lot for including my paper in the program. As Ricardo introduced, I'm going to talk about land use regulation today, and I will focus on how regulation arises at the local level within cities and what are macroeconomic implications of land use regulation in the United States. Well, land use is regulated in the United States cities or pretty much in any cities in the world. So you cannot just build anything anywhere you want. And when I talk about regulation today, I'm going to refer to regulation broadly. I may mean zoning laws. I may mean procedures required to approve a project or a building permit, or maybe less tangible types of regulation like the not in my backyard movement. So people just don't want to have anything built next to where they live. Now, what's peculiar about regulation in the United States is that first, it has increased recently. By recently, I mean the last few decades. And there is tremendous variation across locations. So in some cities, it's very easy to build, Houston, Dallas, Chicago to some extent. In some other cities, it's much more difficult to build. Usual examples that we have in mind are LA, where I live, San Francisco, New York. So it's very difficult to supply new housing in these places. Now, one fact about regulation is that it tends to be more stringent in locations which are more productive. And that's going to be the core of the macroeconomic effect of regulation. Now, why do we care about regulation? There is plenty of empirical evidence that regulation raises housing costs. So it adds an additional wedge between the cost of providing the house and the cost at which buyers buy housing. And housing costs affect where we choose to live. And very often what happens is that one place may offer good productive jobs, but if housing is very expensive there, we choose to forego this high productivity and instead settle in locations which are more affordable. And this brings me to aggregate effects of regulation. So if the most productive places are the most regulated, we may observe lower aggregate productivity because of that. Now, I'm going to argue that this outcome is inefficient. So if you had a free market, you would obtain a different outcome potentially. And this inefficiency arises from the fact that regulation is chosen independently by municipalities. And essentially, they impose externality on the rest of the country. To understand what I mean, regulation in San Francisco could be welfare improving for the median voter in San Francisco, for residents of San Francisco in general. But when people in San Francisco choose regulation to be so high, they prevent people from the rest of the United States from moving into San Francisco and benefiting from local productivity, and therefore impose a negative externality on the country as a whole. So this is not the first paper on the issue. There has been work on the macroeconomic effects of land use regulation. The contribution of this paper is the following. So the papers that I mentioned here above, they typically take regulation as an exogenous feature of allocation, except the paper by Devin Bunton, but she does this in a different way than I do. I'll explain how. And so it's not clear why certain places choose to be so regulated and others don't. Second, all these papers do not differentiate between owners and renters of housing. And if regulation affects house prices in a certain way, we would expect that renters and owners are affected differently. And so I'm going to propose a quantitative framework in which there is a difference between owners and renters, and in which regulation is an endogenous choice of local residents, and see what we can learn from this kind of framework. The three questions I'm asking in this paper are first, why do we observe high regulation in certain cities? So I'm going to have a model of that. Then what are the effects of regulation on productivity and welfare in the country as a whole? And then I'm going to talk briefly about what kind of policies could be introduced by the federal government in order to mitigate negative effects of regulation that I'll find.
Sorry, a quick clarifying question. Is there going to be a difference between regulation on the in relation to productive firms, for example, and regulation to residences? Because you gave the example of both. So I'm not sure which one is an endogenous choice.
Yeah, so there is only one type of regulation in the model, and this is regulation that affects the productivity of housing developers.
Of house, okay.
Exactly. So there is no regulation that affects any. There are other firms, there are production firms, but they are not regulated.
Okay.
Okay. So there are three groups of findings of this paper. So first, I'm going to design a model with endogenous regulation, as I said before. And I'm going to show that this model accounts for about 1/3 of the observed variation in regulation across cities. So it captures a substantial chunk of real reasons for why cities are regulated. Then I'm gonna show that high regulation in large and productive cities indeed leads to aggregate productivity losses. This has been found before by other papers, but because I incorporate renters and owners, I'm gonna show that regulation does not necessarily lead to welfare losses. And finally, I will show you that a federal policy may discourage local regulation and leads to productivity gains and welfare gains. Okay, there is a large literature. For the sake of time, I'm not going to discuss it in detail. The only thing I want to mention is that this paper bridges the largely theoretical urban/political economy literature on regulation and land use, and macroeconomic literature on housing supply regulation, which typically abstracts for endogeneity of regulation. Okay, so let me start with the model. It's a static model from the point of view of the individual. Everybody lives one period. And there are many cities in the environment. People in this model value the regular consumption good, C, and housing. And as you see, the expenditure shares are fixed. And they also value amenities of the city J where they live. And it's a static model. So in a static model, introducing home ownership is a little tricky. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna say that there is an exogenous amount of homeowners in every location. And then there is an endogenous supply of renters in every location. And I'm gonna talk in more detail how one group is exogenous and another one is endogenous. But local employment is gonna be the sum of renters and owners. Okay, so
this, sorry, just to be clear, this doesn't say anything about land, right? There's a fixed amount of homeowners, but
there is also a fixed amount of land. I'm going to talk about this. Okay, so homeowners are, think about homeowners as people from the previous period, if you will. They already bought some amount of housing in the previous period, and in the current period that I'm studying, they do not choose the amount of housing. So they consume some fixed amount of housing in a given location. Okay, on top of owning their houses, they also own all land in the city. Not only the land where the houses stand, but also the land that they can sell to developers, which in turn will build housing for renters. Okay, and from the Cobb-Douglas utility function, that's the indirect utility of owners that you get. It depends on their income from labor. It also depends on the transfers from land ownership, T, on the housing consumption that they don't choose, and on amenities. Now, renters behave more conventionally, so they choose endogenously the amount of housing that they want to consume, and this will depend on local rent. And so naturally, their utility will be increasing in wages, decreasing in rent, and increasing in amenities, X. Okay, so how do people choose where to live? First of all, owners are in exogenous supply in every location, so they don't move. There is a fixed amount of owners everywhere. And when I go to the quantitative exercise, I'm gonna just look at how many owners there are in every city in the US and fix this number. Now, it's not exactly realistic. Owners do move. However, their moving rates are several times lower than the moving rates of renters. And so the assumption of owners not moving captures this fact to some extent. Okay, so when renters choose where to live, they do the following. They take a look at their indirect utility function in a given location, which is a function of wages, rents, and amenities. And they also receive an idiosyncratic preference shock to their choice. So maybe wages in Detroit are not particularly high, rents are not high either, amenities are probably low, but I have family in Detroit, and so I'm going to choose to live in Detroit. And this is what I mean by a positive shock to living in Detroit. The benefit of having this shock is twofold. So first, this allows you to obtain analytical solutions for labor supply in every location. Second, the variance of the shock is essentially the elasticity of labor supply. And when you do counterfactuals, it allows you to understand how labor supply will react to changes in regulation. Okay, this is the equilibrium supply of labor. It's just a logit formula. This is how this is why the extreme value assumption is useful. Nothing deep here, so let me skip. Okay, now firms, production firms. Production firms are as simple as possible. They hire labor and nothing else. And their production is the product of local labor supply times local productivity. Now, one twist, which is standard in spatial literature, is that local productivity depends on the number of people who work in this location. So there are agglomeration effects. All else equal, the more people work in a location, the more productive the location is. And this will be important when you do counterfactuals.
So the externalities come from both these agglomeration, but also from the amenities, right?
Exactly.
I guess what increasing returns to scale, the increasing return to scale to the.
So there are essentially three types of externalities here. There is a productive externality, which is this. There will be a congestion externality, which will come through amenities. And these are local externalities. Then there is a policy externality, which is when I vote on regulation, I don't take into account the welfare of people in other cities.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and this exactly brings us to congestion externalities. Local amenity depends on a fixed term and the number of people who live in the city. You may think of this as, traffic, other potential causes of congestion. Now, I don't force this parameter theta to be positive, so it doesn't have to be that more people in the city is necessarily bad. However, when I estimate this parameter from the data, I find a small but positive theta. Okay, so now I talked about workers, I talked about production firms. Now let me talk about developers of housing. They build housing using land and non-land inputs, which are essentially consumption goods produced by regular firms. You may think about it as capital, if you will, but a capital that can be transformed from the consumption good one-to-one. And importantly, the share of land in every city may be different, eta J. Now, this is the expression for land prices. Let me go to the expression for rents. So the rents will depend on land prices because you need land to produce housing. And the extent to which rents will depend on land prices is given by this eta J. Okay, and now I'm gonna dig deeper into this eta J and show you where land use regulation is playing into this model. Okay, so the production function for housing can be rewritten as this. I'm not solving anything. This is just rewriting the same function I showed in the previous slide. And there are two terms here which I will which I will impose are affected by regulation. Okay, so first is this chi, and I'm gonna come up with a functional form for chi. I'm gonna parameterize it as follows. It depends on land use regulation, and there is a fixed city-specific term. And chi can be thought of as the construction costs. You know, maybe for reasons which have nothing to do with land or land prices, is more costly to build in the city for regulatory reasons. And then the elasticity of rents with respect to land prices, or also the same parameter as the land share, it also depends on regulation with the same with a similar functional form. And the idea of this is you may think of this as a density limit. Essentially, the more housing you have in a given location, the more expensive the land is, and the more the land prices are affecting rents. Okay, so this measures how important land prices are for land use regulation and therefore for rents. And so far I haven't endogenized land use regulation, but when I do so, what I'm gonna do is I'll make people vote on this Z. Okay, so let me try to speed up a little bit. I have some theoretical results, but they are not surprising. I'm showing that under certain parametrical restrictions, which are not strong, local employment is gonna fall in regulation. That's because housing is expensive. Well, and housing prices are increasing in regulation, and land prices are increasing in regulation. So nothing surprising here, and there is empirical evidence for this as well. Okay, so what I'm gonna do now, I'm gonna do some quantitative exercises, then I'm gonna go back to the model endogenize regulation, and then do more quantitative exercises. Okay, so for now, regulation is exogenous, but we wanna see what the implications of regulation are. Okay, the data is that there is nothing non-standard with the data. I'm using a widely used index of land use regulation. I'm estimating the parameters of the model jointly using GMM. So there are 4 relationships that are parts of estimation: labor demand, then the land price equation, housing demand equation, which determines rents, and the congestion equation. Okay, and so all of this is estimated jointly using GMM. I'm instrumenting for certain variables to fix the endogeneity problem, and the parameter values are as follows. So the estimated agglomeration externality is about 4%. This is very close to what is standard in the literature. The congestion parameter is 2%. It's very small. It is not quantitatively significant in terms of affecting the results. Now, this is the important parameter. The elasticity of this eta term, the land share with respect to regulation, is 0.26. So whenever you have regulation increasing by 1%, the land share is going to increase by 0.26%. And this is what owners will incorporate when they vote for regulation, when they think about how regulation will affect land prices. I'll be more specific about that. Then there are some other parameters which I have to calibrate internally within the model. So let me not stop there. What I find, however, so there was this chi parameter, which is the construction cost. I find that in my quantitative estimation is not affected by regulation, and so I'm setting it to 0. It's not statistically significant from 0, and I'm just setting it to 0 in my quantitative exercise. Okay, so I'm gonna do a couple of counterfactuals now before I proceed to the political economy. And what I do is okay, so let me skip a couple of slides for the sake of time. I do the following exercises. I first equalize regulation in all cities, so all cities will have the same Z. I then take one particular city, which is often used as an example of big city with very lax regulation, which is Houston, Texas. It doesn't even have a zoning code. It's not that you can build anything anywhere, but it's not very far from there. And so I cap regulation in all cities by the level of Houston. So no city can have regulation higher than Houston. And then I do the same, but only in a set of superstar cities. Why do I do that? Well, regulation is not a big problem in most American cities. It's a big problem in expensive productive areas like New York, San Francisco, LA, Boston. And so I'm only capping regulation in this set of cities. And this makes the counterfactual more targeted. Okay, so what I find is that in all three experiments, when you deregulate cities, labor productivity in the country goes up between 2 to 3% approximately. And the reason for that is that labor reallocates to more productive cities. However, you don't find any welfare gains, unlike in previous studies. And that's because previous studies only considered renters. So all of the previous models have models of renters. And renters indeed win because rents go down as you deregulate cities. However, owners who benefit from more expensive land, they lose out. And on the net, you find almost no effect on welfare. Okay, I also have city-specific predictions. In the model, there are 200 cities, and so I can see what happens in each particular city. Let me now, Ricardo, how much time do I have left? We started a little bit late. I don't hear you. You are muted.
You still have 5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes. I'm gonna use my 5 minutes. Okay, so I'm endogenizing regulation using a very simple voting model. And what happens is the following. So before renters move in, so renters don't vote here, only owners do. Again, not exactly true, but there are studies in political science that show that renters vote, the renters' participation rates in local elections is much lower than for owners. So they do not affect local politics very much. And so for simplicity, I assume that renters don't vote at all, and only owners determine the level of land use regulation before renters move in. And so one twist to the standard political economy model is that there is lobbying, and imposing a very high level of regulation is costly. They have to pay the lobbyists, which will come and introduce this high level of regulation. Again, not completely unrealistic, because we see from the data that there is a lot of money in cities like LA or San Francisco spent on the public campaigns against new developments. And so what owners do, they just maximize their expected welfare by choosing the level of regulation. And they have three considerations in mind. They take into account the effect of regulation on their wages. How does this happen? Well, if there are fewer people in a location, agglomeration effects are weaker and they lose out. They take into account the effect on amenities, that's point 3. If there are fewer people in a location, they win because there is less congestion. But the most important effect quantitatively is the land rent effect. If they vote for higher regulation, land becomes more expensive and their transfers are higher. So essentially what they do is they vote on their transfers from land ownership, right? And all else equal, they would prefer to have high regulation for that reason. However, in cities with more expensive land and in cities with less land, so I have land supply taken from the data, this effect will be stronger. So because there is so little land in San Francisco, because it's surrounded by the ocean and by the mountains, the land prices are very responsive to regulation, and owners tend to vote for high regulation. Okay, and there are some theoretical results that confirm that. Let me skip this. Let me skip this as well. I'm imposing a particular functional form for the lobbying cost, targeting 2 moments of the observed regulation in the data. And this is one of the main results. So what I can show is that my quantitative model has a pretty high correlation with the data, is 0.55. that's not perfectly, that's not super high, but in the data, there are so many reasons why certain cities are regulated and others are not, that having this model have such high correlation with the data, I think is pretty successful. Okay, it also correlates well with some untargeted moments. And in 1 minute I have left, let me talk about policy. So remember I talked about cross-city externalities in the beginning. One issue here is that LA, when it votes on regulation, it doesn't take into account that it lowers welfare of people in, I don't know, Oklahoma City, because they cannot move to LA because it's so expensive. And so a federal planner could come in and try to fix this externality with the federal policy. One thing about legal system in the US is that local land use regulation cannot be affected by the federal government by constitution. So it's not constitutional to be involved in local land use issues for the federal government. But what the federal government could do is the following. That's one policy. I have more policies in the paper. The federal government could affect local infrastructure through the amenity function via a system of transfers. The idea being is, you know, if you don't build more housing in San Francisco, I'm not going to give you money for the new highway. And so voters will react to the system of transfers and choose lower regulation in currently highly regulated cities. And this will, skip into the results, this will both increase productivity and also welfare, unlike in the experiments with ad hoc reduction in regulation that I did before. Okay, I'm completely out of time, so let me leave it at the conclusions. I studied the local causes and aggregate consequences of land use regulation in the United States and proposed a model with endogenous regulation and renters and owners. And these are my findings. So thanks a lot for your attention, and sorry for running over time.
Okay, we have 3 minutes for questions. Okay.
So I have a question. So Andrea, if you do the quantitative analysis, so for example, do some experiment, so if you have some kind of event back in your head, so how do you measure how much change in these, I mean, your regulation? So try to quantify, I found it's hard to quantify the change in the regulation. Right. What did you do there? I just wondering. Thanks.
Yeah. So the value of Z doesn't have any meaning. It's just an index, and in the data I'm taken is also an index. And so what I'm doing, that's one reason why I'm trying to incorporate the Z into the land share and estimate it, so that the value of Z gives some meaning to the data, right? And so, for example, to quantify Z, just to give you an idea, the elasticity of the land share with respect to Z is 0.26, right? If you increase Z by 1%, you increase the land share by 0.26%. And then that's also why in my counterfactuals, I'm designing the counterfactuals so as they correspond to some real cases. For example, 2 of the counterfactuals set regulation in all cities, or cap regulation in all cities, by the level of Houston. So in Houston, regulation is 0.89. I don't know what it means, but I know that is the level of Houston, and this allows me to have some idea of what this regulation will be like.
So I have a clarifying question on the effect on how on the sensitivity of regulation that you talked about. So regulation was affecting in 2 parts of the Cobb-Douglas, in a sense, right? In one part, it was affecting the land over capital, in a sense. And that kind of, as you said, that was very interesting. It explained how cities react more when it's more scarce land. And how you have, for example, San Francisco.
Yeah.
But it also enters as a coefficient outside, right? That affects both terms. What part of what heterogeneity of cities could we understand these sensitivity effects?
So you could imagine that, for example, there are a lot of cases in which regulation is high for historical reasons. For example, we tend to see high regulation on the East Coast. And you know, maybe a city has a lot of land, but maybe its regulatory code was established a long time ago, and you know, there are lots of historical buildings that they want to preserve. There are other possibly amenities that they want to preserve, and regulation is very high, even though it doesn't have to do anything with land supply. However, to follow up on that, when I estimate this parameter outside of the Cobb-Douglas aggregate, I find that it's essentially zero. So that effect is present in my theory, but when I try to quantify it, it doesn't show up.
Okay. So it is very, so these regulatory costs are really highly correlated with land density?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. Okay. Interesting.
Hi, Andrew. I have a question. I noticed that there is a very interesting result that the TFP would decrease because of this regulation, but not the local welfare. Is it because the model setting that the land is not included in the firm production function? So the firm won't compete for land with the resident.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. And so I'm assuming that land is not used by firms. I don't have a quantitative answer to that. For that, I would have to write a model in which land is an input to firm production. However, one possible one possible explanation could be that the most highly productive firms, they do not necessarily have to be land intensive, right? So for example, if you are a Wall Street firm, if you are an investment bank located on a Wall Street, you know, you have several floors on a skyscraper, but your land footprint is very small relative to your productivity. And so land use regulation does not affect your productivity very much. That's as much as I can do. To give you a better answer, I would have to incorporate land in the production function.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. So we have
Thank
now.
Thank you for your questions.
Yeah. We have now Hani Tao.
Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for including my paper into this very special Congress. I'm Han Tao from Shanghai Tech University. The paper I'm going to present is targeted subsidy and capital misallocation. But nowadays, industrial policy is a quite controversial topic. It is usually adopted by the governments in those developing economies where many firms are financially constrained. Then the government use the policies to help those prioritized firms in the prioritized industries. And the rationale of the government are quite simple. They just want to raise the targeted firm's profits and relax their financial constraint and eventually promote the development of the economy. For example, the Singapore government adopted the preferential taxation for the exporters in the 1960s. Well, the South Korea government launched the famous HCI drug plan and used the government's money to promote 6 upstream industries in the 1970s. Well, in China, it's more common to see the industrial policy. The government just subsidizes the firms that it wants. Well, there are two different opinions about the industrial policy. Some economists hold strong prior against it, since it often creates distortions and bring welfare losses, as we see in China. Well, there are also opinions in favor of this industrial policy, because there are already many existing distortions in the economy. So let's create some new distortions to overcome the existing ones. It's a theory of the second best. Well, this paper will provide a framework to accommodate both opinions, and I will use it to quantify the welfare implications of an industrial policy in China as an example. Well, here is the roadmap. I will first do a preview of the paper, and then I will talk about the theoretical framework and then an application in China's steel industry. Well, first, let's take a look at the result. First, in the theoretical framework, I studied the welfare implications of the targeted subsidy, and this is the industrial policy that I studied. I begin the model with the one-sector partial equilibrium model with heterogeneous firms and the collateral constraints. The collateral constraints is the financial friction in the economy, where the targeted subsidy will, of course, have direct impacts on the targeted firms and the industries who receive this subsidy. The firm's profits will increase and the financial constraint gets relaxed. Meanwhile, the within industry capital misallocation would be changed because capital flow to some firms. The industry level productivity would increase if the subsidy narrows the marginal product of capital across firms. Then I extend this one-sector model into a general equilibrium model with multi-sectors to see the general equilibrium effects. With the general equilibrium model, sectoral capital misallocation would also be changed by the subsidy because the subsidy would flow to some firms in some industries. The sectoral capital misallocation would be alleviated if the subsidy goes to the more constrained industries. And meanwhile, because the industry level productivity has been changed by this within industry misallocation, so the changed industry level productivity would have direct impacts on the aggregate output. And finally, I incorporate production network into the general equilibrium model, and I study the effects with this network. And I find that both within industry and sectoral capital reallocation would be propagated. Then I impose this framework to study industrial policy carried by Chinese government. This policy is called compulsory import delegation on iron ore. Under this policy, only some firms with import license can directly purchase iron ore from international markets, and other steel producers have to purchase those important raw material from those licensed firms. Well, it appeared as an import regulation. However, I find that those firms with license snatched huge profits from the resale business. So it's the de facto targeted subsidy to those privileged firms. And the side effects and data are consistent with my model predictions. So the firms expanded rapidly with faster data accumulation, and the capital misallocation has been worsened. The within industry and sectoral misallocation has bring welfare losses. It will remove this policy would increase aggregate output by about 0.5% in 5 years. If we further incorporate this production network, I find that because the industry is upstream, subsidizing these upstream industries will have a little welfare gain due to the theory of the second best. Well, however, the losses from the within industry misallocation will overcome this welfare gain, and removing this policy would increase the aggregate output by about 0.93% in 5 years. Well, of course, this paper has built on the literature of the resource misallocation studied from Ricardo, and I also using the model techniques from the mentioned Moore 2010 and the Ernest Liu 2019 QJE paper. Well, let me go to introduce my model. I begin this model with a one-sector partial equilibrium model. There are X firms in industry I at the time T. It is partial equilibrium, so the interest rate and wage rate are exogenous. In the demand side, I characterize a CDS aggregation of the firm's products. So the firms are faced with the isoelastic demand. It's facing a decreasing return to scale production. Well, in sales, well, since all firms are here, I modeled to be operated by infinitely lived entrepreneurs. The production technology is constant return to scale. So the problem of the entrepreneur is to maximize its lifetime utility. It has two constraints. The first is the budget constraint, its consumption, investment, repayment of debt cannot exceed its operational income. Another is the collateral constraint. I model this with the techniques in the Moore's paper. So how much the entrepreneur can borrow depends on the net worth it has. If kappa equals 1, which means all the capital comes from its own savings, there's no borrowing. If kappa goes to infinity, then there's no constraints in borrowing. One important thing here is that I model that all firms are in their transactional dynamics. So all of them are at the shortage of capital. Let's see how the targeted subsidy works. So if the firm receives the subsidy, well, definitely its capital would be directly increased by S, and then it will be amplified this subsidy will be amplified by kappa, because they can use it as a collateral to borrow from the banks. As a result, when the firm receives subsidy, its financial constraint will get relaxed.
Sorry, is that a subsidy only to a firm or to a sector?
To firm, to subsidy IX to firm X in sector I.
Okay.
It's a subsidy to those prioritized firms in this industry. Then let's map this dynamic wedge into the static one, and in order to incorporate to map this model to the Shannon-Kleno's model. Here, from the old equation, I can write down the marginal product capital of firm I as two parts. The first is the existing wedges, because all the firms are at a shortage of capital. They are in the transactional dynamics, so their MRPK must be higher than the interest rate. Another is the part that can be changed by subsidy, because when the firm receives subsidy, well, its financial constraint will be alleviated, so the MRPK will go down. This gives us the first channel, that's a direct effect. The MRPK of the firm X would decrease when the firm receives subsidy, and the effect is captured by this tau. Another is the marginal capital return of the industry I, because some firms in the industry get a subsidy. Well, of course, the MRPK of this industry I would also decrease, right? Meanwhile, because the subsidy only goes to some firms, then the within industry capital allocation would change. And this is just the model isomatic to the Shannon-Kleno's model, because the industry within industry mislocation is captured by the variance of the local MRPK across firms. So if the subsidy goes to the more constrained firms, the variance will decrease, and the industry aggregate TFP will increase. Here, I only consider this static welfare implications. The effects from the faster capital accumulation in the industry, the effects on the industry output is not included here. Okay, next, I extended one sector model into the multi-sectors. So now there are M industries indexed by I, and each industry has a representative firm with a Cobalt projection function. And the final output is aggregated by this Cobalt aggregator. The household provide capital and labor to the firms. So the firms run capital and labor from the household. The government can lump sum tax to finance the subsidy it paid to the firms in industries. So here I modeled this distortion in this chi. It's a general set of distortions. It's creating wedges when the representative firms in each industry are using capital. And of course, now the government used the lump sum tax to finance the subsidy. The distortions will increase the price of using capital, and the subsidy will decrease the price of using capital. And as a result, the sectoral capital allocation would be changed. In the first best case, the capital usage of each industry would be proportional to the preference factor beta and the capital share. But now, if there are distortions, the capital usage will decrease, and then I use subsidy to overcome the distortions. So capital usage will go towards the first best case. And meanwhile, there are also within industry mislocations that directly impact on the industry level TOP. So the aggregate effect on the aggregate output under the general equilibrium model is that there are effects from the within industry mislocation, but the direct impacts on the TOP and on the aggregate output. And another is the effects from the sectoral mislocation, sectoral reallocation of capital. From here, if the capital subsidy flows to more constrained industries, okay, everyone moves to the first best, the aggregate output will increase. Then I extend this model to incorporate this production network. It is built on the model framework in Ernest Liu 2019 PhD paper. Well, here, the output of each industry I can be either used as goods for final consumption and also be used as the intermediate inputs for other industries. So in the production network literature, I define two things. The first is the sales vector as a DOMA weights. Another is a little different here. It's called the influence vector. And I borrowed the name from the newspaper. So if there are no frictions, mu would equals gamma. Both are DOMA weights. But here, when there are existing distortions, existing wedges among this production network, okay, mu would be different from gamma. And here is how the subsidy bring welfare implications. Because of the frictions that are existing in the transactions among those industries in the network, this distortion would be accumulated through this backward demand linkages. And the upstream industries are faced with more distortions and are constraining from size. And this is how the theory of the second best works. When the subsidy go to the upstream industries, okay, everyone move to the first best. So here is a illustration. Here is the capital allocation of industry I are faced with two distortions. The first is the direct one. It has distortions in using capital, and the government can use tau K to overcome this distortion. Another is the indirect one. That's from the distortions accumulated through this backward demand linkage. So if the capital are constrained from this indirect distortions, and the government has no idea how to do it, how to overcome it, okay, just use the direct distortions, giving subsidy to help to overcome these distortions. Well, of course, there are also within industry, there are also effects from the within industry capital reallocation. And finally, the aggregate output will be changed by the subsidy from two aspects. First is the within industry allocation captured by mu, and another is the sectoral reallocation. That's how the subsidy bring welfare gains to the upstream industries. Well, then I will use this framework to quantify welfare implication of the compulsory import delegation policy on iron ore in China.
Hani, may I ask you something before you go to the quantitative exercise?
Yeah.
So theoretically, does the network have to amplify the effects of misallocation? Could it be the case that it mutes, the effects of the subsidy? Could it be that it mutes the effect of the subsidy if you know, the suppliers or the buyers substitute away from the sector that is treated by the subsidy?
It could mute the distortions, but the effect should be propagated through this network. There's no definite answer to see whether there are welfare gains or welfare losses. It depends how. It depends where the subsidy goes.
Okay.
Okay. Now let's. I will use this framework to study the welfare implications of the policy in China. Now, why I picked the industry? Well, first, it is the upstream industry. Here is the input-output demand matrix in China. Each column is the import supply sector, and the darkened dots, the black dots, are steel industry. We see a vertical line of these dots. It is very upstream and important to many other industries. The second is that the steel industry in China grew rapidly from 2000 to 2013. In the bar here represents the steel output in China and in the world. In 2000, China only accounts for 15% of the global steel output, but in 2013, the number becomes 50. But meanwhile, the outside reliance of iron ore increased rapidly. It raised from 40% to 76% in 2013, which means that 76% of iron ore used in China are imported from the international markets, especially from Brazil and Australia. However, during this time, we see a huge dislocation in steel industries. Many big steel industries has got bankrupt. For example, the Wuhan Steel Corporation, it is eventually purchased by Bao Steel to avoid bankruptcy. I think that, so I propose a reason that this policy can account for this phenomenon, for this dislocation and the growth of this steel industry in China. Under this policy, only 118 firms can directly import iron ore. and 70 of them are steel producers, and they account for 85% of the iron ore imports. This is carried between 2005 and 2013. So it is endorsed by the government, the Bureau of Commerce, and operated by the industry association. It's called the China Iron and Steel Association. So the purpose is that the government wants to create a monopoly to get the favorable price in purchasing iron ore. They want to unite all the firms into one and get a favorable price. However, in reality, we cannot claim it is a success. Well, although the government say it is, but the price of iron ore grew rapidly from 2000 to 2008, and it only dropped during the financial crisis, but raised up again after that. However, I see that there are huge profits from this business domestically, so it is a de facto targeted subsidy to the steel producers with import license, well, instead of an import regulation. So the data I use is the annual survey of these industrial firms data from the National Bureau of Statistics and the custom trade data. I use the custom data to identify who are the licensed importers. I also get some information from the yearbook of the steel industry and some big steel producers, steel business groups. I find that there are about 200 firms per year in those in the NBS data. So 200 subsidiaries to those 70 business groups. It accounts for about 5 to 6% of all the steel producers in China. Well, first is that the first fact we need to notice is that the profits from this resale is quite large. The blue bar represents the operational profits. You see in 2009 and 2012, there are systematical loss for those producers. However, the profits from resale iron ore is still positive. And in 2008, the Beijing Shougang Steel Group relies on the profits from the resale business from being delisted from this stock share market. From 2004 to 2013, it accounts for about 78% of the total operational profits of all those steel producers. Another fact is that the rapid growth of those producers, we see a very rapid growth of their relative sales and the relative capital stock. Here, I use the firms without this license as a benchmark. It's a relative size change. After the policy was endorsed, the size of the privileged firms goes rapidly, and meanwhile, it is driven by the faster data accumulation. The relative data sales ratio increased, and the relative capital productivity, the relative YOK, has decreased dramatically. And eventually, the within industry welfare loss has increased after 2004. So next, I want to use this model, this framework, to quantify how much of this phenomenon can be explained by this policy. Here, I do a little modification. I use the CES projection function to better capture the features of the steel industry. And second, I assume that there are two types of entrepreneurs with linear utility. So before they go to the steady state, they will eat up everything. They will save everything they have and do not eat. The entrepreneurs are different in their import privilege. You can import with license or without a license. They are different in their initial capital stock, because we know that the licensed importers are usually very large steel groups. They also differ in their productivity gap and some existing wedges. Now use these existing wedges to capture everything that cannot be explained by this policy. So the number of the targeted firms is about 6% of the total. It's the 2003 data. The initial capital difference is the 4.31. It's captured. It's directly estimated from the data. I assume that the resale profits are proportional to the market size, because the profits had changed year over year. So here, for simplicity, I just assume that they account for 78% on average.
Hari, you have 3 minutes.
Oh, sorry. Okay, then I structurally estimate these parameters. The parameters I estimate is only the heterogeneous facts between the two kinds of firms. And here the model are consistent with data. We see an increase in the firm size, debt sales ratio, and decrease in capital productivity. When I did a counterfactual to see how this policy can affect the industry level aggregate capital productivity, the capital productivity has further decreased by 8% in 10 years during this policy. Another is the welfare implication. Well, with this policy, the welfare losses has increased by 8%, about 8%. It accounts for about, it can explain 30% of the total welfare losses. That's what we observed in the data. And in the general equilibrium model, I find that there are welfare losses from both within and the sectorial capital reallocation. And the policy and the removals policy will increase aggregate output by about 0.15% in 5 years. The interesting part is the counterfactual with the production network. Well, we do see some welfare gains from subsidizing the steel industry since it's upstream. However, the sectorial dislocation has been alleviated. However, the within industry dislocation has dominated this welfare improvement. We see that removing this policy will increase aggregate output by about 0.93% in 5 years.
Sorry, quick question. What in channel 3? Why does so without production network? Why does the welfare decrease for the same sector? I thought for the
first because the
in the other one
sector,
without network. Yeah.
Without network, yeah. Because the steel sector already captured too much capital without the production network. So further subsidizing it, further increase its firm size will bring welfare losses. However, if we consider the production network, we would see that because of the distortions accumulated through this network, we can still increase the size of the industry a little, that to increase the welfare gains. So that's the difference between the situation with and without the production network. Well, let's come to an end. In this paper, I built a theoretical framework to show 4 channels of how the subsidy can generate welfare implications. And one key information is that welfare implications are ambiguous depending on how the subsidy and then how the targeted firms and the targeted industries are chosen. Then I use this model to evaluate the policy in steel sector. I estimate the model and find that although the industry are upstream, well, unfortunately, because of the within industry dislocation has dominated all others, so there are finally welfare losses of this policy. Thank you.
I have a question. It's more about the comments. So because of the, we know that those firms receiving the license could resell their imports to other the firm without license. So does that gonna change the target function for those firms? So they, instead of actively produce the goods, they can just make the profit out of doing nothing, just being some kind of intermediary. So
okay, yeah. I understand your concern. So let me answer your question from 2 aspects. The first is that the targeted firms, they must be large enough. So if they stop producing steel, okay, they have the possibility to be delisted from this targeted firm list, and we do observe one. I do observe one firm that is delisted from this list. And the second is that here the firms I studied in the NBS data is all the affiliations to the business group. And in fact, the right to resell the iron ore, this is retained at this business group level, and all those producers, well, they are still focusing on producing steel, and then the business group use profits to subsidize those affiliations, help them to go faster, to expand faster.
Yeah, I'm with you on that part. So what I'm trying to say is here with this some kind of objective change, I'm not saying they are not completely not producing anything. They just not actively increase their productivity or stuff like that. So like the regular firms operate. So in that case, it's going to affect their long-term or medium-term growth chance in the future. So that's my comment.
Okay, I will try to modify the model to including a risk sector to the firm. Maybe, well, I hope I can see some interesting result. Thank you.
No, that's the, I think that this is very interesting. Thank you very much.
Okay.
May I ask something else?
Yeah.
I think it's very interesting that you introduce network in the study. Now, the quantitative results that you obtain, they depend on you do it with the steel industry, and so they depend on the position of the steel industry in the input-output network. I wonder if you could obtain more general results of the following sort. Say, you would see more misallocation if the industry is more centrally located in the network or less centrally located in the network. So, something that has to do with the position of an industry in the network and how this position affects the aggregate effects of the subsidy.
Yeah, actually, the model framework I used here is generally borrowed from Ernest Liu's paper here. I met Ernest Liu when he was looking for a job, and my advisor invited him to CHK. So we discussed, and I find his model quite interesting. So I use this framework to my job market paper here.
Okay.
This is already described in his paper and published in QJE. He's in Princeton now.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so if we have no further questions, we're gonna go for our next presenter. So, Yang, you are muted.
Okay, can you see my slide? Can you hear me? Well,
Yes.
Ricardo, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot for including me in this program. This is a joint work with Gianni and Alexandro Bucci from the Johns Hopkins and Andrea from the IMF. Of course, the views expressed here are ours, should not be attributed to the IMF management or policies. In this paper, the main question we're trying to answer is that how market structure and the technological adoption could affect the efficiency of bank industry. To answer this question, first we need a measurement for the bank efficiency. Here we adopted the definition of cost financial intermediation introduced by the FATF in 2015. In particular, the CFC is defined as the ratio of value added by the finance industry over the quantity of the intermediate asset. A well-known fact is that this ratio stays more or less around 1.88% for almost 130 years, whereas the size of the finance industry has contracted and expanded from time to time. Moreover, Basel's 2018 also found a similar pattern for the advanced European countries. You can think this finance industry as a black box. On one hand, they received the deposit from households and institutions and pay the deposit rate. And on the other hand, they managed to lend out to the end users and charge for the lending rate. The difference is the cost of financial intermediation. This ratio is important for real economic growth because it affects the cost of external finance for firms and households. Holding the deposit rate fixed, a higher CFI implies a higher borrowing cost. If we take a new classical model off the shelf and applying the standard calibration, a rise in 1 percentage point of the CFI could cause the output per capita decline by 5.8%. Here we extended the Philippine series to the most recent years. Then we took a closer look. We find the CFI deviates from its long-term average from time to time. First, the CFI start dropping in the early 20s, and then in the middle of the 1960s, it climbs back up to the recent peak in the middle of the 1990s. Since then, it reverts to the long-run average. In this paper, we're going to focus on the later two turning points after the World War II. We want to explore some possible driving force for the fluctuation in the CFI. The one possible driver is the technology adoption, and another one is the bank regulation and deregulation waves. Here, we provide some indirect evidence to show the upward trend in the 1960s and 70s of CFI is likely to be associated with the usage of the ITC goods in banking industry. Notably, banks are starting to accumulate intangible assets since the middle of the 1960s. Here, the ratio of intangible asset over the total asset is showing in the dark dashed line here, and its timing coincided with the rise of the CFI in 1960s. It's also well known that the U.S. commercial banks are heavily regulated before the 1970s, and since then, some of the regulation has been at least partially lifted, including the branching restrictions, Regulation Q, etc. Here, we observe that the CFI also moves closely to the regulation and deregulation cycles, especially after the nationwide Interstate Branching Act in 1994, we observed the CFI came down substantially from its recent peak. Interestingly, after the Frank Act, we found the CFI pick up again. In this paper, we build up an endogenous growth model with the financial intermediation. Here, the banks are in perfect competitive, and we endogenize the bank's technology adoption in a way that the bank's efficiency involves endogenously. And moreover, we allow the agent to choose two occupations between the bankers and the entrepreneurs, so that the number of the banks will be the endogenous determinant. And the growth of the economy is also endogenous. Our model can count for both the long-run average of CFI and the two important swings in the 1960s and the 1990s. Our model predicted the positive relationship between the bank technology adoption and the rise in the CBI, and the positive relationship between the decline in the regulation and the regulation restriction and decline in the CBI. Also, we constructed balanced growth path which can count for the long-term level of the CBI. So here I used the CBI and the CFI interchangeably. So let me clarify a little bit. In this paper, we're going to focus on the bank industry rather than the entire finance industry, because the banks are still the core of the finance industry in the US. Using the similar rationale as CFI, we construct a time series for cost of bank intermediation. Here we show that the CBI displayed in the red solid line here, is closely attracted the dark dashed line, which is the CFI. The correlation between two series is 0.71. Not only the CBI closely tracked the CFI, but also the credit intermediation is still very important in the US. As shown in the dark shadow area here, the banks still takes a large proportion of value added by the US finance industry, even after the Great Recession. Also, the empirical literature documents that the startups and the SMEs still heavily relying on the banks for external finance.
So quick clarifying, can I ask a quick clarifying question on the denominator of the CBI is market value, right? Not book value.
It's the book value.
The denominator is the book value?
Yes.
Of assets?
I think we do it for using the core report. So not all of those firms are the publicly listed. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So thanks for the question. So the model have 3 agents: the final good producer, agents who choose to be bankers, and agents who choose to be entrepreneurs. The final good producers are using capital to produce final goods. A continuum of agents with idiosyncratic productivity going to choose between being entrepreneurs or a banker, either of which delivers the better return to them. I'll get into details of the setup for the bankers and the entrepreneurs later on. So here, once the agent choose to be entrepreneurs, they have a chance to run a risky project. In this project, they're going to purchase intermediate inputs to produce capital goods, and their productivity depends on both their idiosyncratic productivity and the aggregate productivity from the previous period. However, they can only finish the project with certain probability, eta. With 1 month eta chance, they're going to fail and end up nothing. Moreover, whether the project is successful is a private information for entrepreneur. To finance those inputs, entrepreneurs need to borrow from the banks, repaying the principal and the interest to banks if the project succeed. But if they fail, they pay nothing. Then the entrepreneurs will choose the inputs to maximize their profit, expected profit, and the yields to the demand functions for intermediate inputs. This demand function is very important because it's also the demand function for loans. The banks will be subject to this demand function when they offer the contract. Banks will first establish this infrastructure in order to channel the deposit. And this is the infrastructure cost assurance that the different types of the agents only inform the banks within their same type. So because banks only observe the types of entrepreneurs, but not whether they succeed or not, then they will need to verify the information provided by the entrepreneurs. In doing so, they need to exert some effort with some individual efficiency, AEG-1. That's the cost for the banks. So if you're familiar with the Greenwood and Sanchez and Wang's paper, that would be the same setup as theirs. In order to monitor, they also need to install the ITC equipment with the cost of the kappa times the Q to the square. The QJT here is the quantity of the equipment, and the bank efficiency, individual efficiency is constructed as the AJT is equal to the QJT divided by the AT-1. AT-1 here is the aggregate efficiency for bank industry, and the bank can find out the true status with of the reported by the entrepreneurs with some probability. This probability is increasing and convex function in the effort, and also is a decreasing function in the size of the loans, which means if the larger the loan they lend out, it's harder for them to find out the truth. So each entrepreneur will be offered a contract by the bank, and in which they will specify a manual of amount of the loans and the corresponding interest rate. And the penalty payments if they find that the entrepreneur is cheating. And to design such a contract, the bank will maximize their expected profit subject to 3 constraints. And the inverse the demand for loans and the resource constraint and the incentive compatible constraints. Here, the inverse demand for loans is derived from entrepreneur's first order condition, and this is the core of the corner competition. Each bank will only have a partial pricing power on borrowers, and the resource constraint reassurance the banks can only charge for for whatever the entrepreneur made and most. And the incentive compatible constraint induced the truth telling by the entrepreneurs, which requires which ensures the entrepreneurs make as much when they in line as they telling the truth. I'm just gonna here for each bank will name to every entrepreneurs, so their profit is going to be the summation of the profit across all the entrepreneurs and subtract the infrastructure cost. Now the authority is going to take out a proportion of the profit as the regulatory restrictions. So Andrea, this is the part I'm curious. So we have a very similar setup, and we use the index for controlling the regulatory restrictions here. So the agent will choose between the bankers if the net profit after taxed by the authority exceeded the profit earned by the entrepreneurs. Otherwise, they're going to choose to be entrepreneurs. Here, we're going to show later there exists a threshold of threshold point where the more productive agents choose to be entrepreneurs, and the rest choose to be bankers. I'm gonna, for the time's sake, I'm gonna skip for those the slides, and we're gonna focus on the symmetric equilibrium, and I'm gonna dive into the most important part of the paper. So here, we following the Philippon, and we define the CBI implied by our model as a ratio of summation of all the profit earned by the banks over the total amount of the loans lended out by the banks. So in the proposition 4, we delivered the key message of this paper, the comparative statics of the CBI responding to some change of the state variable. Here are ZT-1, AT-1, and rho T-1. There's a typo here, sorry. And so the response can be composed into two dimensions, intensive margins and extensive margin. The intensive margin is reflected as the response of the existing profit or the amount of the loans to change in the value of the state variable. And the extensive margin is through the change of cutoff points of the occupation choice. So for example, if a rise in the ZT-1 increased the both profits earned by the firms and profits by the entrepreneurs, by the bank, sorry. In the bank, if you go into the bank, it will both increase the profit through the lending process, and also going to increase the infrastructure cost. The response of the CBIs to the increase in the aggregate technology depends on how elastic the infrastructure cost is to the aggregate technology. So if we suppose the psi is sufficiently small, which means the technology is sufficiently inelastic, the rise in the aggregate productivity going to increase the profit relatively more. So the bank's net profit going to increase. However, because on the extensive margin, the increase in the aggregate productivity makes the banks become more attractive, because if you compare the profit earned by lending and the infrastructure cost, then that will increase the gap between those two, and it make the bankers more attractive. So that will induce more entry. That will increase the computation of the banks. For each banker, they're going to have less profit. So that will reduce the reduce the profit margin for the banks. So they're gonna reduce the denominator. As for the denominator, they're gonna because the Z increase is gonna increase the demand, so that will increase the borrow in the lending. So they will increase the denominator. So in that case, we're gonna find the CBI is negatively corresponding to the increase in the ZT-1. As for the AT, they're gonna make the bank more efficient to monitor. So in that case, they can charge for the higher interest rate because they, in that case, they have to invest more in the ITC goods. They can transfer more cost on the borrowers. So that will increase the attractiveness of the becoming a banker. That then for the denominator, because you have less the lenders, the B will decrease. So the CBI is gonna negative corresponding to the aggregate efficiency here. As for the regulatory restrictions, it's only gonna change the CBI through the extensive margin, because they're gonna change if you increase the role, decrease the role, you're gonna make the becoming a banker more attractive, the more entry, and then gonna decrease the profit of the banks. So next, one of the goals in this paper is to establish a model where the CBI stays stable in the long term. So whereas the rest of the economy keep growing. So to do so, we assume the elasticity of infrastructure cost responding to the aggregate productivity is the same as the bank profit earned from the entrepreneurs. So in this case, we have cutoff points of occupation does not alter as the aggregate productivity along with the balance growth path. And then we defined the aggregate productivity and bank efficiency follow the Manley's method. It's like defined in the sense of the average. And then we have the entire economy endogenously involved along with the balance growth path with a certain growth rate, whereas the cutoff points, the CBI, and the interest rate all stays in the constant. Then we're gonna take the model into the data, data, and we try to calibrate the model to the long-term average for the in the data. And the 4 targets we choose is the growth rate of the TFP growth rate of the US GDP per worker, and the long-term average of the CBI, and the deposit rate. So we here we calibrate the model to the data. It fits pretty well, and we examine the comparative statistics of the CBI and the variable of interest corresponding to some exogenous shock to some observables. In particular, we discipline certain parameters to the extent where a target observable change to the certain value along with the new balance growth path. And the purpose of this exercise is to examine how the model responds to some potential exogenous shock. The observable here we choose here are the deposit rate, the regulatory changes, and the relative price of ITC good, and the growth rate of the TFP. The corresponding parameter that we choose to discipline are the RD, rho T-1, alpha, and kappa. Sorry, there's no alpha, the kappa and the eta here. So moreover, we consider a range of the values for the target, the observable. For each value, we reverse engineering and we back out the associated parameter value necessary for the observed to achieve in a new balance growth path, and then we calculate the value for the rest of the variables. here the main variable of the interest are the CPI and the growth rate of the economy. So the first exercise we did is for the reducing the relative price of CPI goods by 30%, which is we found in the data in the recent 20 years, we found the CPI dropped by 0.5 percentage points, and the long-term growth rate increased by the 0.2 percentage points. And then we, because all the banks take the deposit rate as given for now, so we're increasing the deposit rate from the 3% to 5%, and then we find the CFI increased by the 0.4 percentage points, and the long-term growth rate dropped by 1 percentage point. And this finding is staying in line with the once the Fed increased their Fed fund rate, and the spread between the Fed fund rate and deposit rate gonna increase. The third exercise is gonna reduce the regulatory restriction index by 5 percentage points, decreasing from the 35% to the 30%. We found the CFI dropped by the 0.2 percentage points, and the long-term growth rate increases by the 0.2 percentage points. And the last exercise is we're gonna increase the eta, so to match the growth rate of TFP by 0.2 percentage points. So in that case, we're gonna find the CFI dropped by the 0.3 percentage points. So in summary, we built up the model that can explain some constant 2% of the CPI and a no frequency change in the data. Here in this model, we incorporated the corner competitive banks, and this bank's gonna have some are gonna adopt the new technology. Of course, the quantitative analysis I just represent is just very preliminary. So all the comments and feedbacks are welcome. And right now, Andrea is using some of the branch level data to identify the mechanism. So hopefully, you're gonna see gonna have some positive results to share with you guys later on. That's pretty much it for me today. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Any questions?
Thank you, gang. Any questions?
I may ask a general question if
Sure.
you don't mind. So you focus on banks only, as far as I understand correctly.
Right.
However, we see I think it's increasing over time. Correct me if I'm wrong, but we see an increasing share of shadow banking, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
institutions that perform functions similar to banks but are not necessarily banks. How should we think about them in this framework?
Yeah, we debate about it. So because it's another, we have the heterogeneity in the firm side, and we argue about this before. And here we decide to focus on the bank owning this time because first, the credit intermediation is still important. We want to get into the bottom of how the banks works and how it's going to affect the real economic growth, and for the first step. Maybe later we're going to incorporate shadow banking into this analysis. I think this picture, to address your question here, this picture is the decomposition of the U.S. The value added by different departments. Here, the credit intermediation, which is mainly done by the commercial banks, is the dark area, and the shadow banking you mentioned here is the kind of the green area here. So I admit especially after the 1990s, the green areas accelerate a lot. but compared to the commercial bank, it's still relatively a little bit smaller than the bank. So for now, we're going to focus on the banks. That's a very to extend this analysis into shadow banking. I think it's very important. But that will be the next step.
Thank you.
So somewhat related. My question is about the regulatory constraints or the regulatory action by the government that you assume. How general that is, or how do you think it would change your comparative statistics and your balance growth overall? That because your regulatory seems to be like targeting profits in a sense, which usually the regulatory would think on this type of banks is usually like constraining a lower bound on the assets or something like that.
Yeah, I'm with you. That's the reason I asked Andrew for his take on how he quantified the regulatory change on this matter. So here we have, I think we encountered the same problem. We don't know how to actually measure the regulatory index there, because there are so many the regulatory changes in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And it's hard to, we know there, as a matter of fact, that there's some of the changes, but we don't know how to quantify them or fit them into the model. It's not like we have a relative price of IDC good that we can derive in our model, but in this framework, it's pretty hard. It's pretty hard because if we focus on the banks, so the profit of the banks, and I think the profit banks is first affected by the regulations for sure, but also gonna deal with the competition by the other institutes like the shadow banking institute. So so it's hard. I mean, we'll think deeper on this, but this is a very good point.
If I may add to that. There is a paper by a colleague of mine at USC. So they try to measure they try to measure monetary spending on regulatory tasks in different kinds of industries, and this may be helpful for you to quantify the effect of regulation.
That would be great. So
yeah, I could send the link to you.
Great. Thank you very much. Any other comments? I think I'm running out of time. I think. Thank you very much.
I think perfect. I think it was just in time. Thank you very much, Gang.
Okay.
And now is my turn. Okay. Can you see the screen? Can you see the slides? Great. Okay. Perfect. Okay. So the main question I'm trying to tackle here is what is the aggregate effect on share buybacks on capital allocation? And so the main promise of a firm is to pay back money to shareholders. So this graph shows the net amount of payouts that have been distributed by the corporate sector to shareholders as a share of their total profits since 1960. As you see, the payouts were relatively stable in the 60s and 70s, and they have been increasing after the 80s. They became more volatile, but also higher. Now, what is interesting about these payouts is that before 1983, the only mechanism that firms had available to pay out to shareholders was dividend payments. They couldn't distribute money by buying back their shares in the open market, what we know now as share buybacks, mainly because doing so was legally ambiguous. They were liable for price manipulation. But after 1982, the SEC enacted this rule that harmonized the legal framework and effectively introduced open market buybacks as a viable alternative mechanism for firms to distribute money. So dividends stop being the only available mechanism after this rule. However, when we look only at the dividend share of profits, we see that dividends have remained quite constant with and without the rule. So the new buyback mechanism changed the amount of payouts, but did not seem to trigger a noticeable decline in aggregate dividends. So it is very hard to argue that buybacks and dividends are perfect substitutes from the point of view of the firm. And there are many reasons why this can be. And the question I'm interested in is what is the effect of this having two alternative channels for the aggregate economy?
Ricardo, a quick clarifying question. So net payouts are dividends minus buybacks, that's it?
No, dividends plus buybacks minus equity issuances, minus secondary equity issuances.
Okay, got it.
Right? Because buybacks can be like composed by also issuing money. Yeah. Okay. Well, at the same time, there have been some changes in the corporate sector in the US. The amount of investment as a share of total profits has declined. The amount of financial assets or cash holdings, mostly held by the corporate sector, has increased. And the profitability of this capital has also increased. So the main message of this paper is that buybacks improve capital allocation and welfare. The three features of public firms are going to be relevant for this analysis. The first one is that firms face much higher adjustment costs to pay dividends than to pay out through buybacks. The second feature is the agency conflict inside public firms. Managers are better informed than the shareholders who own the firms, but they like to build empires, so they have a bias towards capital. The third feature is the broad use of high-powered incentives for this agency conflict, right? That way, manager compensation reflects the stock price of the firm one way or the other. So with these three features, I'm going to show you that the buyback rule, such as the one in 1982 that introduces buybacks or decreases the cost, regulatory cost or any other cost of doing buybacks, reallocates capital and cash by two channels. The first channel is a direct channel, and it happened that buybacks, when you introduce buybacks into the economy, they are now represent a cheaper way to pay out transitory cash flows. Right? It is easier for shareholders of firms that are now temporary low productivity to take out the cash rather than leave it accessible for the managers. And then most of these excess funds, what's going to happen is going to flow back into high productivity firms who now need this money and can raise it now less costly. The aggregate of this channel is going to be a better allocation of resources across firms. But there is a second channel to which these buybacks act, and that is that when buybacks become available, the stock price becomes more sensitive to profits. Why? Because when buybacks become more available, every dollar, an extra dollar inside the firm now can be more easily taken out if needed. So this means that this dollar is now more valuable. This makes the stock price more sensitive to profits, and this means that manager compensation itself becomes more sensitive to profits, leading for better incentives for managers. What happens now is that managers who previously were misbehaving, now when they face lower productivity, they're going to choose cash over capital. On the aggregate, what is it going to mean is going to be a better allocation of resources, but within the firm. And we're going to see impact of these effects on the economy. And the joint product of these two effects is going to be that on aggregate, buybacks are going to generate higher capital profitability, lower investment on the aggregate, but higher levels of cash in the corporate sector. So I'm going to skip a little bit, not going to the detail of the literature, but I'm just going to say that this paper touches like a topic that's very well studied in corporate finance, which is corporate payouts. And the way I do is I take, instead of understanding the causes of this difference between buybacks and dividends, what I want to understand is the consequences. So I take this difference as given, and I'm trying to understand the transmission channels that make this have important effects in the economy. I look at the macroeconomic effects in general equilibrium, and I discover these two novel transmission channels. And the techniques I use are borrowed from this dynamic models of financial frictions and capital allocations, whereas most of these models focus on the frictions that prevent how to get money inside the firm. This is a friction that prevents firms to get money out of the firm, right? And we're going to show the effects of this. So first of all, I'm going to show the stylized facts on payouts. I'm going to first explain the first two stylized facts quickly, and go into deep detail on the third for time purposes. The first fact that I find, or that I corroborate about dividends, because this is not a unique fact, is that dividends are not disappearing, right? As you may hear, like is heard in like policy circles, right? Dividends are still actively used. As a proof, the share of profits distributed as dividend has remained quite stable since 1983, right? And in fact, it has increased a little bit since 1983. Now, this is not just due to some firms that pay large dividends and the rest of the firms not paying dividends at all. Even when we look at the unweighted share of firms that pay dividends, I see that also these levels are at levels very similar to 1983. They decreased 3 percentage points, but relative to its level of 30 percentage points, it's almost constant. Now, one may ask that maybe these dividends are remaining just due to some inertia. So this is not due to some old firms that just have kept paying dividends out of inertia. No? If we look at the share of firms that initiate dividends every period, right, it is still the same rate as it was before. Firms are initiating dividends, which means like they go from 0 to positive dividends at a positive rate and at the same rate as it was before. The second fact I want you to keep in mind is that this initiation of dividends and buybacks seems to be set independently from firms. Why? What I mean is that firms that pay dividends are just as likely to initiate buybacks than firms that don't. Similarly, firms that normally do buybacks are just as likely to initiate dividends as the ones who don't. Right? So the decision for them may come from different purposes. Right? Now, the third fact, I'm going to go into detail about it, and this is that dividend payments are more persistent than buybacks. Right? And I'm going to characterize it in a special way. I use panel data from public firms from 1984 to date. And for each firm year observation, I obtain the dividend change and compare it to the dividend change next year, normalized by today's sale. So in the top we see a histogram of what are the dividend changes across firms, leaving the 10% of the tails. In the bottom, this is a non-parametric regression that tells us how expected dividend changes depend on past dividend changes. What we see is that they almost run through a flat line. This means that dividend changes at the firm level are almost unpredictable. This is a signal of very high persistence. Regardless of the observed change of dividends we see today, we always expect 0 changes of dividends tomorrow. Right? This is not surprising that dividends are sticky. But when we look at buybacks, this is the shape that we see. Right? The first thing to note is that buybacks are quite predictable whenever we see positive changes. Right? This is not consistent with a persistent process. This is consistent instead with a very transitory process. When we have a positive change in buybacks, we know that the next period there's going to be a negative change in buybacks. So buybacks are used for transitory processes, whereas dividends are used for persistent processes. Right? One more thing I want to take up from here is that in the top we see also the histogram of buybacks compared to the histogram of dividend changes. So in the first picture I talked a little bit about how buybacks are more volatile on the aggregate, but here we also see that at the firm level this is also true. Right? Buyback changes are way more volatile than dividend changes, and this is going to be more relevant for the model. So I'm going to use this model, now I'm going to introduce it, to explain and to measure the effects on these buybacks on the aggregate economy. The model has a representative household with time-separable utility, with a felicity over consumption of labor. There's a continuum of firms that maximize shareholder value. The firms are going to face productivity shocks and financial and agency frictions. Competitive markets for labor, competitive markets for firm equity and for safe assets. We're going to have assets, corporate income, and capital gain taxes. Importantly, dividends are taxed at the income level, at the income rate, whereas buybacks are taxed at capital gains rate. I'm going to leave the taxes for the purposes of this presentation out because they're not important to explain the mechanisms, but they're going to be important for the quantification. So just keep in mind that there are always going to be taxes in all this framework that I will show you. Finally, I'm studying an economy without aggregate risk. So this is about allocation, how allocation of capital goes. So this is I'm going to focus on a steady state equilibrium where wages and interest rate is what's going to adjust to clear the markets. So let's let's dip into the single firms problem. Firms produce according to Cobb-Douglas production using capital and labor with decreasing returns to scale. Productivity has two components: a persistent productivity shock, defined as an AR1 process with a persistent rho and volatility sigma eta, and a transitory productivity shock, that is an IID process. From here, we can already define operating profits of a firm as the static maximization of revenues minus labor costs. Why? Because labor is going to be a spot market. So for a given capital, for a given productivity, persistent productivity, and for a given transitory productivity, the firm was going to maximize the labor such as to maximize this operating profits. Right? Now it's going to the core part of the model, and I'll explain it using this diagram for timing. Every period, firms are subject to persistent and transitory shocks. The firm is composed by a long-lived shareholder and by a short-lived manager. Right? So the shareholder is representing, let's say, a board of directors, right? Or in order, let me correct that, the board of directors represent perfectly all the shareholders. So this board of directors cannot observe the productivity shocks Z and epsilon in the current period, but the managers can observe the persistent productivity shock. Manager cannot observe the transitory shock either. So there is already an informational advantage of managers relative to shareholders. But the shareholders, what's going to happen every period? The shareholder starts with some resources. The shareholder decides the amount of new equity to issue, if needed, the amount of dividends and buybacks to pay out, and then the funds that are going to be available for the manager to use. Then the manager decides how to use these funds. The manager observes the persistent productivity and says, I'm going to invest in risky capital, or I'm going to invest in safe cash holdings. After this decision is done, the transitory shock is realized, and labor is hired on the spot market, production, profits are realized, and then at the end of the period, profits, capital, and the financial profits from cash are accumulated for the next period.
Sorry, Ricardo, I have a question here. So whether to do the buyback is the decision by the shareholder or manager?
The shareholders, the board of directors.
Okay, but in the reality, I thought it's the managerial decision. Is that?
Well, no, both buybacks and dividends are approved on a quarterly, on the quarterly meetings.
I see.
Manager recommends.
I see.
But both dividends and buybacks are approved. Right? Sometimes it's what it's a little bit. But I agree that the manager has some input in it that I am abstracting from, and we can talk at the end. How does that change the model? One thing that I'm also abstracting is that the manager cannot borrow. Only the shareholders can do it through equity. Right? I have an extension of the model where the manager can also take debt up to a collateral constraint, and it doesn't change the qualitative results. It changes quantitatively a little bit, but this is again for illustrative purposes. Thank you. So we can see here the three frictions in the model. Issuance frictions are going to make equity costly and it's going to make this thing important that are needed. Tie-up friction is the difference. Is going to determine the difference between dividends and buybacks, because one is going to have adjustment cost and the other is going to have just regulatory cost. And agency friction is going to impact the manager's problem. So let's go through the manager's problem. The manager problem, I'm going to define first the next period, the stock price is going to depend on the resources at the end of the period, the dividend promises, and the persistent productivity. So what is the manager is going to do is, given the dividends that were promised by the shareholders, persistent productivity, and the funds that are available, the manager is going to choose capital and cash to maximize this function, right? And I'm going to maximize, what is this, the maximizing function? Is an empire building motive that is increasing and convex in capital, and a stock compensation. That means that depends on the stack. The resource constraint is that, okay, each of the funds can only be used either in capital or in cash. And the resource constraint tells us that next period resources are going to be the profits that I get, the capital that is undepreciated, and the financial profits from cash. The manager does not know the transitory productivity shock, so profits are still uncertain, but it tells us how manager's decision is going to impact profits. Right? And for instance, if persistent productivity is low, managers should invest more funds in cash than in capital, but the manager is going to have this extra bias that's going to make him choose more capital instead. This is going to overall reduce profits and resources. An important part of this is that the sensitivity of the stock price is going to matter for managers' incentives, right? Because it enters directly into the first order condition of the manager. If the stock price is very sensitive to resources, manager is going to put more weight on the second term than on the first term. So now let's see the problem of the shareholder. Given the manager's policies of capital and cash, the shareholder chooses funds, dividends, buybacks, and new equity to maximize the shareholder value, which in this case is the stock price. The stock price is recursively defined as by the net shareholder payments, which is dividends, buybacks, minus the equity issuance. And the resource constraint that is faced by the board of directors is going to be that these resources that I get from the previous period can be used in funds approved for the manager, in payout, or if needed, I can issue new financing. Now, the main channel available for the shareholders to control managers' misbehavior is to reduce available funds. So if persistent productivity is low, shareholder will try to control the manager by reducing funds. And the way to do it is to increase payouts. How effective this control will be is going to be depending on the cost of these payouts. How costly is to adjust dividends, or how costly is to do buybacks. Similarly, if persistent productivity is high, the shareholder is going to try to raise funds by issuing equity. So here we can see how the two channels by which cheaper buybacks mitigate agency distortions. First is by its effect on the shareholder constraint. Right? Cheaper buybacks allow the shareholder to reduce funds more flexibly. That is, they're going to be able to pay out quickly, and that is going to translate into less investment, but also less cash because reduced funds. This is, in effect, a reduction of the manager's discretion. It constrains managers' hands, so it makes managers less able to do decisions. The second channel that we talk is through the derivative of the value function with respect to resources, is that cheaper buybacks improve managers' incentives. They make the managers rely more on the second term of their utility function. This is going to be for a given set of funds. The manager is going to save more in cash, and is going to invest less in risky assets. This channel retains the manager's information advantage, right? It just changes the incentives of the manager. So to quantify the model, I'm just not gonna go too quickly over it, but to estimate the technology parameters of the productivity, I use it only from production data with a GMM approach. Then I pick the parameters that return to households, tax rates, and empire building from the literature. And what I match, the moments that I match are to estimate the other friction parameters, right? The frictions that are relate to the capital adjustment, to the adjustment cost of dividends, buyback dividends, and equity issuances. I match moments from payout of capital structure of public firms using data sample from 2005. Why 2005? Because this is the time where we don't have big tax changes. This is after the last major Bush tax cuts and before the Trump tax cuts. Okay, I just want to show you the functional form of dividend adjustment cost and buyback cost. Buyback costs are regulatory, so they are linear in the amount of buybacks. And dividend costs are a convex function of dividends, right? And they are only positive when you reduce dividends. So you can increase dividends as much as you want without cost. But if you reduce dividends, this is when like you incur this adjustment cost. So what are the results of this model? First, I want to compare this model with the generated payouts that we see. We saw this home-shaped part on the buyback dynamics, and we see that the model correctly like matches how buyback behaves, how buybacks are a way to pay out these transitory shocks. Whereas dividends, as we saw, it was this flat line, dividends are used for these persistent shocks. We see that the model matches most of the dividends pattern, except from the negative side. And this is because of the convexity of the costs. In the model, when firms want to reduce dividends, they decide to reduce dividends in steps, right? And that's why negative dividend changes are usually linked to a negative dividend, right? But since there are many dividend reductions anyway in the public firms, I think it's a big deal, but it tells you how the model works. So I thought it was important. So now, what is the main result is that now I do a counterfactual exploration. What's going to happen is that I relate the effect of buybacks by making a counterfactual economy where we ban buybacks, right? We don't allow buybacks to happen. And that is going to be an example of what would happen before the rule change. So what the model predicts is that introducing buybacks is going to imply a decrease in investment, an aggregate investment of 8 percentage points. That's almost about half of the observed decrease in investment that we see in the national accounts. And it's going to increase an increase in financial assets, right? That is almost the whole amount of increase in financial assets that we see on the national accounts. Importantly, to understand these aggregate changes, I want to show you how those changes happen at the cross-section of firms, which is how does the reallocation happens. Let's see this graph that is going to show you how on the x-axis, the graph tells us the persistent productivity of firms. And on the y-axis tells us the amount of capital that is installed in these type of firms. So before the buyback rule, we see that this is the distribution of firms according to their persistent productivity. After the buyback rule that allows buybacks, we see that the lower productivity firms now are able to do more payouts. This means that they are able to decrease their capital allocation, right? And in exchange, higher productivity firms can now issue capital less costly, right? Why? Because their stock price increases, right? So capital effectively reallocates from low to high productivity firms, right? But what's going to happen, the effect on cash is that cash also reallocates from low to high productivity, right? Why? Low productivity firms also decrease their cash holdings because they can do more payouts. High productivity firms increase their cash holdings, not only because they can issue more shares, but also because managers are better behaved. And now you have the very high productive firms that are saving a lot of more cash because managers have now these incentives to save cash more. Finally, okay, I'm just gonna go quickly on what does this say for efficiency? We know that this reduces investment but increases cash. Is this efficient? Well, relative to a benchmark model without agency friction, we see that the profitability gap, which is that tells us how well the capital was allocated, is greatly reduced. Right? Before the rule, we were 2 points below the profitability gap. After the rule, we're almost closing the profitability gap. However, the investment gap suffers a reversal. We were overinvesting before the buyback rule, and now after the buyback rule, we go way beyond. Right? We overshoot and now have very low investment. How does it happen? Well, it happens because let's look at the same capital allocation image, but now with that orange graph representing the benchmark model without agency frictions. Buyback rule is very good at helping firms decrease their capital, but it is not very good at making productive firms increase their capital. Right? It increases, but not enough. So the overall, why? Because now you are constraining a lot of the manager's decisions. So the informational advantage that is provided by the managers is kind of reduced. You have these experts in the economy that can see persistent productivity one step ahead. And now you are tying the hands of many of them. But now they behave better. So there's a trade-off, and that has this investment and profitability composition. Right? I'm not going to talk about the welfare impact because I closed the model with a representative household. So it's mostly for qualitative purposes. But to conclude, this is the main takeaways. With an equilibrium model of firms, buybacks mitigate agency conflict by increasing the flexibility advantage over dividends, but also by this interaction with high power incentives, by helping high power incentives be more active in disciplining managers. Thank you very much.
Ricardo, yeah, I come back to my earlier point. So if you go back to your manager's problem, if it is the manager's decision to decide the buybacks, so by increasing the buybacks, they're gonna artificially junk up the future stock price. In that case, gonna increase their welfare too, the profit too, right?
Well, but okay, so buybacks do not like necessarily need to artificially increase the stock price, right? Buybacks is just a transmission of funds to shareholders. So when you pay buybacks, the price is going to adjust, right? It's going to
I thought they're going to reduce the outstanding shares. Does that? I'm not sure. So
buybacks reduce the outstanding shares, but you also get rid of money. So the shares that are still outstanding are still valued the same.
Okay.
So if I have $10 in 10 shareholders and I pay out 2 of them, now I have 8 shareholders, but $8. So the price per share should remain the same.
Oh, okay. That's also
right? However, but you're right that the decision to make the manager not pay out the buybacks, not decide the buybacks, is important, and it's important, but it's important for the cash holdings.
I see.
Because the buybacks being the decision of the board makes the managers now be able to save in cash instead of just dropping the cash to shareholders.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting paper.
Ricardo, I wonder, I find your results on counterfactual experiments very interesting. In particular, that the introduction of the buybacks increases reallocation of capital towards more productive firms. I wonder how these results can be connected to the literature on the rise of income inequality, in particular those papers that argue that the increase in income inequality, a large chunk of the increase in income inequality is due to having more unequal firms, which pay more unequal wages to their workers.
Yes, totally. So this is of course, my welfare measure right now it's a very rough welfare measure, which is from a representative household that owns all the firms and that provides labor in a competitive labor market. So this is not the question that I'm asking, but you can see already here that it does create inequality. You have it does create it makes the productive firms way larger,
right?
With much higher amount of safe assets for cushioning, right? And the low productivity firms become more depending on their transitory shocks. They become super small and they can just like live by the day. Now, yes, but there's a question. I'm like one of my the things I'm interested in also is to make this. What does this imply for wages? If we don't need to just by doing a little bit of heterogeneity on the household. Like right now, wages increase. Because because households own the firms, and it's more the income effect what makes it the firms kind of it makes the labor this utility increasing. That's how wages increase. But if I make a household divide the household into workers and capitalists, for example, where the capitalists own the firms and this other type of households that work. then that already creates a decrease in wages, even though it increases productivity, and even though this increases overall output, this reduces wages due to like higher rents of these super productive firms. And the decrease.
So it reduces aggregate wages, but at those firms who receive more capital, it shouldn't reduce wages, should it?
Well, it also reduces wages because you have decreasing because I have a decreasing returns to scale.
I see.
So the firms that are very like that are larger have just higher rents.
Okay.
And they all go to the shareholders. So right now there's no difference. There's still labor competitive markets, I guess, competitive labor markets. Okay. If you like, once you get into this assumption, I agree with you totally that this will create some interesting effects. Yeah. Okay.
Hi, Ricardo. I have a question. So here, the householder are firm owners, right?
Sorry?
So here, in the model here, the households are the firm owners.
Yes.
So if the households want, so if there are misallocations existing within those heterogeneous firms, so this means that if the household just push some money back from those firms and use them to reinvest, is it for sure to increase the capital allocation efficiency?
Yes. I'm not sure that I understand the question.
Well, I mean, so because there are some redundant cash held by those firms, and the shareholder just want to get the cash back and use this cash to reinvest across the firms. So is this behavior for sure to increase the capital allocation across the firms?
Yes. Okay. Right. But the households don't make the decision about this cash. The households own it, but they just receive the profits. The ones who make the decision about cash are the managers of the firm, and the manager has its own incentives to keep the cash in this firm and not send it to other firms, right? So it's a bit of this simplified assumption that households own the firms, but they don't have this decision to do it. But yes, they will. A social planner would like it. So that in that sense, you're right. A social planners would do that. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Andri, Hani, and Gang. So
thank you, Ricardo, for organizing this.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Thank you, Ricardo.
Well, see you.
See you. Take care.
Stop recording.